Welcome to the next podcast from Millinery.Info. This episode is with Rebecca Reid. Rebecca is the milliner at Opera Australia, and in this episode she shares with us some of her favourite productions. This was made possible thank you to the support of our wonderful podcast sponsors. These include Hatter's Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House of Adorn, Lifted Millinery, and we're thrilled to welcome the support of Hat Mags, the publisher of the Hat Magazine and Hat Lines. You can find a link to each of their businesses in our show notes, either on your podcast app or through our website. We'd love to invite you to become a sponsor of this podcast series if you are interested or able. Just head to www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info, or there's also a link on our website. If you have any questions about being a sponsor, please send us through a message. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining me today to talk hats. And a question I love to start with is, how did you first become involved in millinery?
Wow. Okay. To make a very long story short, I went to Charles Sturt University and did a Bachelor of Design in Theatre and Television, which I have actually just found out they've basically just cut the course. So it was a wonderful experience, but sadly is going to be no more as of next year. So within that course, it did a little bit of costume, lighting, sound, set, props, and stage management. And I sort of went more towards costume design because that's how my brain is wired. And then I had a wonderful lecturer called Julie, who was a textile lecturer, and she said, you should apply for the Thelma Afford Award, which is a Australian award, which is for costume people for further study. So I applied, and there was, I think, 3 or 4 other people that applied that year, and everybody wrote in their sort of blurb that they all wanted to study offshore, and nowhere in the guidelines did it stipulate. It just said it's a grant for future study, but they didn't award it to anybody because everybody wanted to study offshore, and they thought, well, people should study within Australia. So when I was researching that, as in like, what would I like if I had this money that suddenly came to you? Where would I go? What could I do to study? And one of it was millinery, and it was at the Kensington and Chelsea College in London. And Kirsten Scott was the head teacher there at the time. So I ended up having this very random conversation with Kirsten. I think it was like 8:30 Australian time and whatever the time was in England. And so she basically said, so you can sew? And I said, yes, I can sew. And I said, I can use an industrial sewing machine and I can do this. And I've kind of done that. She's like, great, you're in the course. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. So I packed up my life and I moved to London, and I got my London A to Z, and I worked out how to get to Kensington Chelsea College. And I started on the first day, and it was an high national certificate, which I think is like in Australian terms, it's sort of like the Cert 4 at TAFE. So you should have done previous millinery stuff to get into the course, but I hadn't. And I was with this class with everybody who'd done a year of millinery beforehand. And Kirsten on the first day said, okay, everybody, go grab a block and a straw and off you go. And I was like, what's a block? And then what's a straw? And that's how I got into millinery. So it was a jump in the deep end and try and swim thing. And I had some wonderful lecturers that year at Kensington and Chelsea. I had Kirsten, and Jane Smith taught us theatrical millinery, and Ian Bennett was also very involved with the course at the time, and he was very, very, very generous with his knowledge and his patience, and just the people that we had there were great teachers to learn from. So what was going to be just going to England for 1 year to learn millinery turned out to me staying there for 4 years. And I did what every sort of Australian did, where I had 4 different jobs, and I ended up working for sort of 3 different milliners all at once, and they all knew
Wow.
that I was working for each of them, and I made sure that everybody knew that I was working for everybody, and I had my days where I was. So yeah, I got to work with Bridget Bailey, Noel Stewart, Misa Harada. I worked in Stephen Jones' workroom for 3/4 of a year, and sort of other snippets of people as well. So that's how I got into millinery.
And was there any aspect of that in your theatre course that you'd done?
None.
None.
Whatsoever.
And you just went, let's give
pretty
millinery a
much.
try.
Pretty much. It was, and then it's like, you've got to learn to sew with a thimble. I'm like, oh, okay, I better go buy a thimble. Where do I go get a thimble from? So no, there was zero millinery in the course. It was just a very passionate lecturer, Julie, who taught us textiles, but said, like, you can do anything that you want to do, just try, go, explore. But I had never done millinery. So no, I made a theatrical piece, we'll call it, for the Golden Gun Awards, which was happening in Wagga. It's no longer around. And it had horsetails in it and wire, and I somehow managed to find a head block that would be 57 centimeters, and I kind of made something and I entered it, and I think I placed and got some money from it. So that was the only bit of millinery that I did, but it was no way traditional at all, if that makes any sense. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so while you were in London, did you have a plan that you were you now live back in Australia? When you're in London, did you know how long you were going to stay for? Or are you just there to enjoy it for as long as you could, or did you go in with an idea of that?
When I first went to London?
Yes.
No, it was just to go to London for a year and then see what happens. And my dad said to me at the time, he goes, if you do 2 winters in London, you stay. And he was English. And my half brother had moved over to London, and he went for 2 winters and is still living there now. And he's been there for over 20 years. When I was in London, I actually met my now husband over there. So that was, but the reason why I came back to Australia, sorry, I've just gotten so sidetracked. I do that. Sorry.
Right.
I promised a university friend of mine, Mel, that I would make her wedding dress. So I came back to make her wedding dress, and that was the thing that brought me back to Australia. Plus my parents were getting older and I wanted to sort of spend a bit more time with them. And so I came back, but I wasn't able to get any millinery work. I actually worked as a postie for 3 years. I think it was 3 years. Maybe it was 2 years. I can't remember. Yeah, I used to deliver post. When I first came back to Australia, I was a postie.
And then, so when you, after your postie experience,
yeah,
what was the gateway position back into millinery for you?
Okay, so at the time when I was working as a postie, my godmother introduced me to Katherine Kelly. So I was helping Katherine when she was in her first studio space in Roselle, not the amazing, beautiful, big one that she's got now, in like her very, in her smaller studio. So I would deliver post, finish at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then drive over to Roselle and help Katherine for a few hours. So that's how I started helping here. And then I also did a little bit of work for Susie O'Rourke for a little bit. And how I came to the opera was a friend of a friend spotted the job listing on Arts Hub, which I would not have seen otherwise. I was not looking for, a millinery job in a newspaper at all. And it was that person telling my friend Penny, hey, there's a job, Rebecca should apply. And so that's how I applied for the opera job. Somehow, they told me once, I think it was nearly 50 people that applied.
Wow.
And when they emailed me saying, please, can you come in for an interview? I was actually over in England getting married. And I said, I can. I'm not in the country right now. I'll be back as of this date. And I think I was one of the last people to be interviewed. somehow I managed to make it into the opera. I think with the power of hindsight, I think one of the things which benefited me at the time, or what helped me get the position when I was working with Stephen Jones in his workroom, I was in the manufacturing section. So we would have to copy hats. There'll be one hat and then you'd have to copy it for production and copy the trimmings and do all that. So I think that was probably one of the skills that I had, which benefited me getting the opera job, because there is quite a lot of, no, not quite a lot. Quite often I have to reproduce a hat which has been on stage for a while and is either the wrong size or it's coming to its last legs or something like that. And so I have to reproduce and replicate that existing hat. So I think that was possibly one of the skills that I had, which benefited me getting a job at the opera. And I've been there for nearly 10 years now. So I'm obviously doing something right. They're still employing me. And some days I think I'm like, oh gosh, okay. Yeah. So that's how I made it to the opera. I'd never done any theatrical millinery before either, other than the small bit I did with Jane Smith in the course. Yes, but in England I was just doing fashion millinery, which can be quite different, I suppose, to theatrical millinery. Yeah.
And how did you find that transition when you first started? Were there things that you had to adapt about your techniques, and how did you discover the differences between the fashion millinery and the theatrical millinery?
So when I started at the opera, they had they brought in a really lovely person called Rick McGill, who is a Sydney theatrical milliner, and he was there to kind of help, I suppose, transition me or sort of show me the ropes a little bit. Skills that I've had to adapt and learn. I suppose it's more materials are different. We use different materials. I can count on the number of fingers on my hand how many times I've actually used cinema for a theatre hat. It's very rare. When I first started the opera, we hadn't discovered faux shape yet, so we were using military canvas and things like that, and I had never seen that anywhere before. So yeah, I think there's a few different materials that gets used in theatrical millinery versus fashion millinery as such. And as far as skill sets go, no, it's still the same. Like sewing wise is still the same, and yes, I use a sewing machine, and yes, I use glue, and yeah. So crin loops. There we go. That's one thing which I hadn't seen before. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Yeah, we use crin loops to hold the hats onto the wigs. So that's something that I hadn't ever seen. I was like, okay, righto.
And when you're working on a production, do you work in-house at the opera production company?
Yeah. So I work in the wardrobe department at the Opera Centre. The Opera Centre is separate to the Opera House. Many people think that I get to work at the Opera House. I do sometimes, but Opera Australia is a completely different company. So we work at the Opera Centre, which is in Surrey Hills in Sydney, and I work within the wardrobe department. There is a mezzanine floor, which is where I am, with the wig makers as well. So I work alongside the wig department too, because we have to work quite closely sometimes. So I can't really do much off-site. I have not done any work off-site because there's always, it's not just working on one show. I could be working on 5 or 6 different productions at once. And in my small house that I've got here, I actually only own one hat block in my personal collection. So yeah, I have to work on site and use their equipment and their stuff, and then have fittings and talk to designers and work with the workroom and work with the cutters and all that. So it definitely works a lot better working on site than working remotely. Yeah.
And you mentioned you could have multiple projects, 5 or 6 on the go. How does that work? Do you know in advance how many you're working on, and how do you know what you're going to be making?
So the opera each year releases their season. So there's a Sydney summer season, a Melbourne autumn season, which is when the company goes down to Melbourne and the Australian Ballet goes up to Sydney. They switch venues. Then there's Sydney winter and Melbourne spring. And then there's a few other, there's opera on the harbour, there might be a musical, then there's the regional and touring Oz Opera production, which is the one that goes all around Australia. There's school shows. So there are actually, I had a quick look just before I started talking to you. I looked at the 2020 brochure and there was over 16 productions that would have been going through this year. So I get a document which has the operas listed for Sydney summer, Melbourne autumn, Sydney winter, Melbourne spring, and it's broken down. And then they have sort of on it when they're going to be starting fitting, and then it's when it's going to be trucked, because obviously there's time between having to leave the venue to leave the opera centre to getting to the venue. So you've got the truck time or the ship time, and then when it's actually on stage. So there is quite a time. Some are short, some are longer from when I actually start to when it hits the stage. So it's just a matter of having to look at this program and talking to people and having meetings with people and then working out what is going to be going and what the order is going to be, and as far as principal fittings versus the ensemble fittings and things like that. It's also, it's not as straightforward as just 16 productions. Some are revivals, which go into storage and come back out. A very good example of that is La Boheme. That's been going for nearly 10 years now.
Oh.
I made the original hats and they are still going. They have, oh gosh, those hats could tell some stories. Oh my gosh, they have done a lot of shows. They do a lot of shows each year. So if it's a revival, then the revival hats probably need a refresh or a fix or a resize, or every single hat is different. And then if it's a complete new build, then that has a bit more of a lead time from when you initially start talking to the designers to when you start manufacturing to when it hits the stage. So it changes for every single opera, if that makes any sense. But yes, it's lots of trying to be organised, which I'm trying to work on. I've made every deadline so far. Yeah. It always gets there. Yes.
And it must be quite it's quite an adaptive process too, because it's not just down to you necessarily getting to decide and design on the hat, but you're working within a team of other creatives and makers as well.
Yes. So I don't actually ever get to design anything. I'm not a designer. So the opera employs a costume designer who will design everything from the hat, the wigs, makeup, clothes, shoes. And then there'll be a costume illustration. Some designers are very detailed with their illustrations, and some designers are a bit more freehand with their illustrations. So my job is to turn what is the 2D on paper into 3D reality. So I can suggest some things that what they're hoping for may not actually work. I can also suggest, there's also a word in the opera workroom that gets used a lot, which is budget. There's not enough budget for this. So the budgets can also change their designs a bit. From what is the first draft through to what is the final. It can evolve and adapt quite a lot, so it sometimes never looks like what it was right back at the beginning. Yes, so I have to speak to designers and speak to the costume supervisors that are working on that particular show, and then speak to the wardrobe boss and go from there. And so I don't actually get to design, but I do have a bit of input into what can work and what can't work, so to speak.
And in terms of those discussions, because millinery materials are, although a little bit different to fashion millinery, but materials are quite specific to the industry. Do you source those or assist in the sourcing? And maybe when you get that sketch, they say, let's make this in, I don't know, flat, let's make this a flat pattern hat. And you're like, oh, actually, that would be better as a felt hat. Is there that kind of discussion that goes on?
There is that discussion that goes on. But as far as the sourcing goes, we have a buyer called Miranda Brock and an assistant buyer called Nicole, who, Artios, who they do all the buying. It's their job to buy and source. And Miranda and Nicole might start buying 3/4 of a year before we might even speak to a designer, or half a year before we might even speak to a designer. So, yes, I can suggest that some materials may not work and have a bit of input that way, but I don't actually ever do any of the buying as such. Yes, there has been times when a designer might have one particular idea in their head and I say, well, actually, I think this is going to work better as a felt, or we can use a wool felt as a base and then we can cover it with something else. So yes, I can have a little bit of input that way. And then there are some designers who start off saying, like, I know nothing about millinery and you're the expert, so what do you suggest? So every designer works differently, and every designer has a different I suppose understanding of millinery, or what they'd like to see achieved, or millinery might be quite high up on their list, or it might be lower down on the list of where they want to focus on. So yeah, it's a very big piece of string. Every single production is different and every designer works a different way.
Absolutely. And what has been, so you've been with the opera, was it about 10 years, you said?
Yeah, coming up to 10 years.
And what have been some of your favourite productions that you've got to work on?
Oh, gosh. There are so many. The first big production I worked on was Bohème with Julie, the costume designer, and my brain has just completely forgotten her surname. I'm sorry, Julie, if you're listening. The budgets were more then. The time budgets were also more then. It was a bit of a different feel then. There was more budget and more time. So that show is very beautiful and elaborate and textural and colourful, and that was a very big test of, like, can you do this? And I also had Rick McGill helping me with that one and sort of semi-supervising me and sort of telling me that everything will be okay and this is the order that you need to do this in, because it was the first show and first big show, and I was like, I cannot do this. And he's like, it's okay, this is what we're going to work through. So he helped me through that one. Then there's been the Magic Flute, which is a Julie Taymor design. She designed The Lion King. So she actually designed the opera Magic Flute first and then went back and designed Lion King second. So there is a lot of elements within the Magic Flute opera that she refined and sort of did again for the Lion King, which is quite interesting to watch. That was really interesting because there was ballet dancers with like 2 meter tall bird heads, which had to go onto a skull cap. And that was also a very, very technical production. That was the first production where we started using Photoshop within the workroom. So that production, we had to copy from drawings the American production, which we basically had to nail it just from a drawing, which was and some measurements that were sent over. So that is another sort of example of having to reproduce and replicate, but for Australian head sizes and Australian casting and all that. So that was another very big learning curve, I suppose. And yeah, I also rang up Rick and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this. And yeah, so he was not able to help that time. But yeah, that's been a good one, which is always quite fun when it comes back. And there's been other, I suppose, another big production that maybe lots of people may have seen is My Fair Lady. Yes, I got to meet Julie Andrews. Yes, the Angels sang behind her.
As they should.
Yes, as they should. So besides meeting Julie Andrews, My Fair Lady was huge. I suppose I had the most people working with me. Normally I work by myself, or there might be one or two other people, depending on how busy it is. I think with My Fair Lady, there was possibly 6 or 7 of us crammed around my table. So I was in charge of that team of people, and it was a long build. It was probably 4 or 5 months, I think, by the time it started to the time it finished and hit the stage. My Fair Lady was huge. Obviously, there is the very famous black and white ascot scene that every single person knows. Those hats were huge. They were... Bronwyn Shooks did a lot of the straw braid work on that, because she is a master at that, and we seeked her help out for those tricorns and bicorns and everything else with that. Some of the hats I was able to do within the centre with a cinnamon base and straw braid sewn on top, and the larger ones we'd send out to Bronwyn. Those hats, people probably didn't know that they were held onto the wigs by giant, we call them whopper poppers, so giant press studs, held the stand that the hats were on onto the wig. And on the stand for transport, the transport magnets, we used very, very strong magnets to hold everything together, and everything was popped onto the wig. So it all had to be at perfect angles. And John David Ridge, who was the associate designer, one of his very strong focus points was the angles of these hats and having to get it just so. So, yes, when that scene came out on stage and I was there for the dress rehearsal and no hats fell off, I could actually breathe out. Yes. And I went, okay, I did it. And so besides My Fair Lady, there was lots of other hats within that. There was the Cockney hats, and there were straw boaters with flowers, and there were men's hats, and then there was the very obviously iconic Eliza lilac wave hat. Yes, so My Fair Lady, with reflection, was a very amazing experience. If you told me at the very beginning of Millinery that I would be doing a production of My Fair Lady from scratch with photos, working with the associate designer, John David Ridge, I would have told you that you're dreaming. That's not going to happen. During it, it was very stressful. But with reflection and time, it was good. It was hard, but it was good. And then there's other productions, like we don't always do very big operas. There's also beautiful small productions that have come through with lovely designers, so it's very different. Sometimes they're tiny operas and sometimes they're huge. And every opera, I learn something new, or I challenge myself a little bit more.
What I want to ask you about next is, you mentioned in there about Foss shape and when that came on the market as an option for millinery and theatrical millinery. What did that provide you in terms of options, and how did you first start to use it, and how has that evolved as you've progressed with the material?
So the Met Opera did Magic Float, and in their Bible came out and it said, this photo, this material, this, and then they listed Foss shape. And we all went, what is Foss shape? And so then we had a conversation with them via the powers of the internet, and they sort of explained about Foss shape and how it was steam activated, and if you do this is how it works, and if you do that, and they said, but you can't really control the shrink. And at that point in time, we didn't actually have any Foss shape inside the building, so I had no idea what they were talking about. And then Miranda, our buyer, she got some Foss shape in, and there was me and Torsten, who's the head tailor, looking at this thing that looks like wadding with a block going, how does this work? So in that regard, it was a complete learning curve because no one had used fuzz shape. Fuzz shape is wonderful because it's very lightweight and very, very strong. It also can work quite fast if you need it to. There isn't the drying time of stiffening and things like that. It is also weather resistant, which you have to factor in for the outside operas because it always seems to rain a lot in March when they put on the outside opera, even though technically when they did all the research, it should have been the driest time of the year, but it really is not. So yes, fuzz shape gets used quite a lot, mostly as like the foundation support. And then on top of that, it gets built up, or we use it for armor, or yes, it's pretty much, I don't think any fuzz shape has ever walked on stage just in its natural state. I think it's always been painted or covered or something like that. But it is a very useful product in that it's speed and strong and lightweight.
When you're producing the headpieces or hats for the production, you're not putting it on someone's head. There's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on there. Could you tell us a little bit about that process and how you make a hat for what's something that's so variable?
Sure. Okay. So you have the performer who, if it's a man, generally, if you put a wig on and it's a hand knotted human hair wig, their head circumference might go up 1 centimeter. If it's a machine manufactured synthetic wig, it might go up 2 centimeters just because of the bulk. With women, obviously women have got, and men, some men have long hair. Women have different styles of hair, different lengths of hair. So they have to wig prep their hair, which involves pin curling their hair up and then putting a stocking cap on. So you take the measurement of their head with a stocking cap on, and sometimes this can change their head size by 2, 3, 4 centimeters, depending on how much hair they've got. And then on top of that goes the wig. So then you need to add whatever else for the wig and how it's dressed and styled. So generally, many opera singers have larger heads and lots of the dancers have smaller heads. I can say that from looking at many people that dancers have small heads, singers have large. And so I just have lots of numbers written down. I have got the person's head circumference and then wig prep circumference and then with a wig. And so each show is different. Some hats can be made so they can be multi-sized if possible, because obviously that performer may not come back the following year or whenever this show is rebooted to fit the same hat. They might be cast as a different role, or opera hats, if possible, need to be able to be adjusted in size. And sometimes they're not. So then they have to be remade to copy the hat. The biggest head I have ever made a hat for is 65 centimeters.
So do you have what's the blocks that you make these pieces over? Are they scaled up? How do you get a block to 65 centimeters? You have one, or you felt it up, or
yeah, you can. You find what you've got closest to, and then you pad it out. The hat that was 65 centimeters was actually an Egyptian pharaoh hat, and it was made out of PE foam and gold lycra. So that was kind of panelled and glued and sewn and all that sort of stuff. I have been known to use a bucket and very different things to block stuff off. So sometimes, yes, blocks get padded up, or I use, we've got a big range of wooden wig blocks, which are kind of like poupée heads, I suppose. They're just a very generic head shape. So I've got everything from 52 up to 64. So that can be a starting point, and then I go from there. But obviously every single hat is different. So it's not necessarily just block of felt and off you go. It's some like cut and sew, some are pieced together from foam, like dense foam, not sort of your spongy foam. Yeah, so it's find what I have that might replicate it and then go from there, I suppose, and pray a little bit and have a fit and sit there and pray to the millinery gods that it's going to fit. Yeah.
And what's one of the strangest materials you've made a headpiece out of?
That's a good question. I have used fly screen. I've used fiberglass rods. I've used leather, but that's not necessarily a strange piece. I once, it wasn't for an opera show. It was the opera decided to fundraise amongst their patrons. And one of the fundraising things was a custom-made hat from the Milliner. She brought in her taxidermy peacock. I had to pull apart her taxidermy peacock and turn it into a hat. So
wow,
the feathers of it, got transformed into a hat. That was an interesting thing.
What a strange project.
Yeah, what a strange project. Strange materials. I also get to work quite closely with props. And I've had to use watering cans and turn them into hats, tambourines. Oh my gosh, lots of things that you wouldn't necessarily think would become a hat have become hats. Yeah, there's a section of the opera that's called it's the school shows, and so they go around the schools performing, and the designers often have a lot of fun doing that. So that's the watering can hat and things like that. So yeah, you get these things on your desk, you go, oh, okay, I have to make this stay on a head. Okay, all right, yeah, just give me a few minutes to think about it. So I do get to work quite closely with props, and I go over and I'm like, Carlos, what do I do for this? Or can you drill some holes in this? Or how am I going to make this work? So yeah, lots of, I suppose, fly screen, fiberglass. It often depends on what or where the opera is going to be. If it's outside, inside. If it's schools, it's got to be really strong, because they might do 2 or 3 shows in different schools each day, and it's on and off and chucked in a car and moved and everything else like that. So yeah.
And do you get to, once you've produced the hats for production, do you get to attend the runs to see the pieces on stage? What's the process once you've completed a piece?
So that's a good question. It changes depending on the opera. If it's a new opera and a new build and it is quite hat heavy, sometimes I'll be called down to the technical dress or the dress rehearsal, just to make sure there's no issues. So one of those examples was My Fair Lady and Magic Flute, and sort of very hat heavy productions. I sometimes will be called down earlier. Otherwise, yes, I do get to attend the, it's called the general rehearsal, which is when they have basically a full audience, but it could just be family and friends and people like that. And so we will see the operas then. If it's a revival, we can go and see it, but then we have to make up the time. So it all depends on what else is happening at the time. Sometimes I don't get to see everything. I think last year, there was a whole season where it was really, really, really busy, and I didn't actually get to see anything because the general rehearsals are happening at the same time as I had fittings, and I just, sometimes time is against you as far as letting you see productions.
And what's one of the great advantages, or what's one of the things you enjoy about working in that creative space within the opera production room?
There is an amazing array of knowledge and skill amongst everybody who works there. So that is really, really wonderful. Everybody's very, very high skilled. And it is nice, even though I work by myself, well, not, I'm in the same room as other people, but I am quite often the only milliner there. If I have an issue, I can go down and either I can talk to the wiggies about it, or I can go downstairs and talk to one of the cutters and say, I really don't know how to do this. Do you have any thoughts, or can I just bounce ideas off you? So it is really nice to be able to do that and have other people to talk ideas with and things like that. So everybody who works there is very knowledgeable and very, very generous with their help. And that's nice. And I've been there for nearly 10 years and it's like a little family. And I haven't been actually back at the opera since March. So it's nearly 5 months that we have been stood down. The workroom has been stood down. So yes, it's interesting times. Yeah.
And so with you're based up in Sydney, so COVID's had quite an impact on the production. Is there an idea, well, no one knows the timeline that's going to return to work, return to shows and theatre and all that. Do you have any pieces coming up that you know will be in one of the future upcoming productions we can look forward to?
Devereaux, which was meant to be hitting the stage June, July. It has an Italian director and Italian designer, and obviously COVID happened and everything got shut down. So I was in the process of starting making wide collars, big wide collars, and talking to the designer about that and trying to work out patterns. And there was a whole lot of budget. There's that word again, budget, with trying to shuffle everything around. So Devereaux is on hold. I think the opera has cancelled over 500 productions this year. They have recently just announced that they will not be resuming anything. They were trying to work on, they were hoping to get a production of The Ring up in Brisbane, but that's had to be postponed. So it's going to be very interesting to see where the company goes next, as far as were 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whenever they were working on the 2021 season on paper, and I'd be like, we're going to do this show, and we'll do this, and we'll do this, and we'll get all these performers in and all these designers and have all the contracts out. It's going to be very, very interesting to see what they're going to do for next year. So I don't actually know when anything that I've been working on is going to hit the stage. It's all this very big limbo. So I think one of your questions you're going to ask me is, what are you working on now? And
yes,
nothing. I have 2 young kids at home, so me doing millinery happens at the opera. That is my downtime. I haven't really done any millinery since being off. I feel like I might not even remember how to do millinery by the time I go back. Yeah.
I'm sure it will come back. There's some trained muscles in there.
Yeah, hopefully. So yes. In answer to your when is things going to hit the stage, I don't know. I've got no idea. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, such a challenge.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful to hopefully at one stage the opera will be able to return to their productions and you'll be able to get back to some hat making.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see. Who knows what the future holds? But yes, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for chatting hats with me, Rebecca. It's lovely to have you as part of our podcast series.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Lauren.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Millinery.Info with Rebecca. We'd like to thank our podcast sponsors for making this episode possible. Hatters Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House of Adorn, Lifted Millinery, and Hat Mags. You can find a link to each of their businesses in our show notes. That's either on your podcast app or through our website. We really appreciate their support. Are you interested in becoming a podcast sponsor? Did you know it's just from $15 per month, and it's run through a platform called Patreon? As part of your sponsorship, you'll receive a thank you in our monthly podcast, a link to your business on our website, and in our monthly newsletter. We hope you've been enjoying this series. If you're a new listener, we welcome you, and thanks so much for joining us. Have a scroll back through the feed to see if you can find some favourite episodes. If you're a long-time listener, we're so grateful to have you back. Remember that you can subscribe to our email list or to the Millinery.Info podcast in your favourite app, so you don't miss when another one's being released. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you another episode soon.